Hi everybody, welcome to Live Blogger. In this tutorial series, we have been creating this stories design using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. So here we can see we have these stories over here, and if I click on any of these stories, the story will be displayed in a full screen view. And in the previous video, we completed designing this full screen view, and this is how it looks right now. Now in this video, we will add the functionality of this stories design using JavaScript. So let's get started. Right, here is our source code, and here we have these images which we're going to use in our design. And here I also have this JavaScript file, and here I have created this array of objects. And here we can see that we have all these objects. We have the ID, the author name and the image URL. So we have the contents of all the stories over here inside this all stories array. Now you can go ahead and make changes to this and add your own stories. And if you want to delete one of these stories, you can just delete this object from here. Right, now the next thing we will do is we will display all these stories dynamically. So right now if you go to the HTML file, we can see that all the stories are hard-coded over here in the HTML. So we need to delete all of this, and we need to create these stories using JavaScript. So we will loop through all the items inside this all stories array, and we will create this division. So let's go ahead and create a function for that. Here let's create a function called create stories. And in this function, let's loop through all the items inside this all stories array. So for that we will use the for each loop. So I'll just type all stories dot for each. And for each of the single stories, I'll just call it S. Right, now the first thing we need to do is we need to create this division with the class of story. So let's type const, and I'll just name it story equals document.createElement div. And let's give it a class of story. So let's type story dot classlist.add, and here let's type story. Right, now the next thing we need to do is we need to create this img tag, and we need to add the image URL of that story. So let's type const, and I'll just name it img equals document.createElement img, and let's type img.src, and we need to set it equal to this image URL of the current story. Now we are calling the current story s, so let's type s.image URL. Now the next thing we need to do is create this division with the class of author, and we need to add the author name over here. So let's type const author equals document.createElement, and let's create a div, and here let's type author.classlist.add, and we need to add a class of author, and let's type author.innerHTML, and we need to set the inner HTML to the author of the story. So let's type s.author, and then we need to add the image and the author inside the story. So for that you have to type story.append child image and story.append child author. And now we need to add this story inside this container division which has a class of stories. So let's go ahead and reference this. So here I'll just type const stories equals document.querySelector stories, and now let's type stories.append child story. Let's go back to our design, and here we have the full screen view displayed right now. So let's go ahead and hide this first of all. So if you go to the CSS file, here we have the full screen view. Now what we will do is when we want this stories full view to be displayed, we will add a class of active. And when we don't want it to be displayed, we'll just remove the active class. So by default, I'll just set the display to none. And here let's add the styles for the active class. So let's type stories full view.active, and let's set the display to grid. Right, now if you go back to our design, we don't have the full screen view displayed right now. So if you go back, and if you go to the HTML file, and if you scroll down, and if you go to the full screen view, and if I just type active, now we can see that the full screen view is displayed. Right, now let's go back to our JavaScript, and let's call this function. Before that, let's go ahead and delete all of these stories. So let's select all these stories from here and we'll just delete it, and we will generate all the stories using JavaScript. So let's call this function create stories. And now let's go back to our website, and now we can see that we have all the stories displayed with the correct content. Right now, the next thing we will do is we will display the full screen view when we click on any of these stories. Before that, let's go ahead and set the cursor to pointer for these stories. So if you go to the original design, when we hover over this, we have the pointer. So let's go back to the CSS file, and we have a division with the class of story. So here I'll just tap cursor pointer, and now we have the cursor set to pointer. Right now, let's go back to our JavaScript file and let's write the code to display the full screen view. So for that, let's create a function, and I'll just call it show full view. And here we just need to add the active class to the full screen view. So here we can see we have this division with the class of stories full view. So let's reference this. So here let's tap const stories full view equals document.querySelector, and let's tap stories full view, and let's scroll down, and here let's type stories full view dot class list dot add active, and we need to remove the active class when we click on the close button. So let's go back to the HTML file, and here we can see we have this division with the class of close btn. So let's reference that. Here I'll just type const close btn equals document.querySelector close btn, and here let's create an event listener for that. So let's tap close btn dot add event listener, and let's listen for the click event, and here I'll just type stories full view dot class list dot remove active. Now what we need to do is we need to add an event listener for all the stories. So here we can see that we are looping through all the stories. So let's add the event listener over here. So here I'll just type story dot add event listener, and we will listen for the click event, and here we'll just call this show full view function. So let's type show full view, and now let's go back to our design and let's click on one of these stories, and we can see that the full screen view is displayed. And if I click on this close button, it goes back to the default view. But if you click on any of these stories, we have the same story displayed over here. That's because if you go back to the HTML file, here we can see that we have hard coded the data. So here we have the image and the author already set. So what we need to do is we need to set the image and the author of the selected story. For that, let's go back to the JavaScript file, and here instead of just calling the function, we will pass the current story. So here instead of just accessing the single story, I'll just add one more argument over here, and I'll just call it I for the index. So this will give us the index of the current story, and here I'll just pass the index. So I'll just type I, and here we will receive the index. So I'll just type index. You can name this anything you want. And now what we need to do is we need to update the data. So I'll just create a function for that, and I'll just call the function update full view. And let's also create a global variable for storing the current index. So here let's create a variable, and let's call it current active, and by default I'll just set it to 0. Right now let's create this update full view function. So here let's tap const update full view, and here before calling the function, I'll just set the index to the current active. So here I'll just tap current active equals index. So in this way, the current active variable will have the index of the current story. Right now let's go ahead and set the image and the author. So if you go back to the HTML file, we need to reference these two elements. So we can see that it is inside this stories full view division, and in that we have the story division, and in that we have the image, and we also have this division with the class of author. So let's reference these two elements. So here I'll just tap const story image full equals document.querySelector, and let's type stories full view story img, and now let's reference the author. So let's type const story author full equals document.querySelector stories full view story author. Right, now let's scroll down, and here for the update full view, let's type story image full dot src equals, and we will set it to the image URL of the current story. So here let's type all stories, which is the array, and for the index I'll just type current active, and let's type dot image URL, and for the author let's type story author full dot inner HTML equals all stories current active dot author. Right, now let's go ahead and save this, and let's go back to our design and let's see whether it works. So let's click on this story right here, and we have the correct story displayed over here. Let's click on this story, and we have the correct story displayed. So the full screen view is working all right. Now let's go ahead and write the functionality of this next and previous buttons over here. So let's go back to our HTML file, and let's see what are the classes for the next and the previous buttons. So here we can see we have this stories container division, and in that we have the previous btn class, and for the next button we have the next btn class. So let's reference these two elements. Here let's type const next btn equals document.querySelector stories container next btn, and let's type const previous btn equals document.querySelector stories container previous btn. Right, now let's add event listeners to these buttons. So here let's type next btn.add event listener, and we need to listen for the click event, and here let's create an arrow function. And what we need to do over here is that we need to scroll the container division left and right. So if you go back to the HTML file, here we can see that the container division has this class of content. So let's reference this. So here I'll just type const stories content equals document.querySelector stories container content. Now let's scroll down, and here let's type stories content dot scroll left plus equals, and let's try 300. And now let's add an event listener for the previous button. So let's type previous btn.add event listener, and let's type click, and let's create an arrow function, and here we will just type stories content dot scroll left, and let's type minus equals 300. Right, now let's go back to our website, and let's click on this next button, and we can see that we are taken to the next stories, but we don't have a smooth scroll. So further, let's go back and let's go to the CSS file, and for the content let's add a smooth scroll. So let's see the content. So here we have the content. So here just tap scroll behavior smooth, and now let's go back and let's click on this next button, and we have a smooth scroll, and the scrolling is working all right. Now when we are on the extreme left side, we need to hide this previous button, and when we are on the extreme right side, we need to hide this next button. So let's do that. For that, let's go back to our JavaScript, and let's add an event listener to the stories content. So here let's type stories content dot add event listener, and we will listen for the scroll event. Now here let's add an if condition, and let's type stories content dot scroll left, and we need to see whether the scroll is less than or equal to, and let's add a number over here. I'll just type 24. So if the scroll left value is less than 24, we need to hide the previous button. So further, let's go back to our CSS file, and we'll create a class for that. Here we have the selectors for the previous and the next buttons. So here let's go ahead and add some styles. So I'll just tap stories, container, previous btn, and by default we will set the opacity to 0, and we'll also set the pointer events to none so that we won't be able to click on the button. And let's also add a smooth transition. So let's tap transition and let's set it to all 400 milliseconds ease. And now let's add the active class. So let's tap stories, container, previous btn.active, and here let's tap opacity and let's set it to 1, and let's set the pointer events to auto. And we need to do the same for the next button as well. So let's type stories container, next btn, and here let's type stories container, next btn.active. Right now let's go back to our JavaScript file, and here let's type previous btn dot class list dot remove active, and let's add an else, and here let's type previous btn dot class list dot add active. Now let's go back to our design, and now we can see that the previous button is displayed, but if you go all the way to the left, the previous button disappears. Now here we can see that the next button is not being displayed, so that's because we have set the default opacity to 0. So let's go back and let's go to the HTML file, and by default we will set the next button to active. So let's tap active. Now we can see that the next button is being displayed and the previous button is not being displayed, but if we scroll to the left, we can see that the previous button is being displayed. Now when we scroll all the way to the right, we need to hide the next button. So let's go back and let's go to the JavaScript file. Now here we need to first of all calculate the maximum scroll value. So let's create a variable for that, and I'll just call it max scroll value equals. Now we need to set it to the scroll width of the element. So let's tap stories content dot scroll width minus the actual width of the element. So let's tap stories content dot client width, and since we have added a buffer of 24 pixels over here, let's also do that right here. So let's tap minus 24. So this is going to be the max scroll value. Right now let's go ahead and let's see whether the stories content scroll value is greater than this variable. So let's tap if stories content dot scroll left is greater than or equal to max scroll value. If it is so, then we need to remove the active class from the next button. So let's tap next btn dot class list dot remove active, and let's add an else, and here let's tap next btn dot class list dot add active. Now let's see whether this works. So let's go back to our design, and now let's scroll to the right, and now we can see when we are all the way to the right, the next button disappears, and if we are all the way to the left, the previous button disappears. So it is working all right. Now let's go ahead and add the functionality of the next and the previous buttons of the full screen view. So we have these previous and next buttons over here. So let's go back to our HTML file, and here we can see we have this division with the class of stories full view, and in that we have a division with the class of previous btn and also a division with the class of next btn. So let's reference these two elements. So here let's type const next btn full equals document dot query selector, and let's type stories full view next btn, and let's type const previous btn full equals document dot query selector stories full view previous btn. Right now let's add event listeners to these two elements. So let's scroll down and let's type next btn full dot add event listener, and let's listen for the click event, and let's create an arrow function over here. And here the first thing we need to do is we need to increment the current active variable. So if we scroll up, here we can see that we are keeping a track of the current active story. So let's scroll down and let's type current active plus plus, so this will increment it by 1. And now we need to simply update the content, and for that we already have created a function, and we have this function called update full view So let's call this function. In this function we are updating the story image full and the story author full. So let's scroll down and let's tap update full view. And now let's go back to our website and let's open this story and let's click on the next button, and we are taken to the next story and the values are changing. Right now let's close this and let's write the code for the previous button. So let's tap previous button full dot add event listener, and let's listen for the click event, and let's create an arrow function. And here we simply need to decrement the current active by 1. So let's tap current active minus minus, and let's tap update full view. Now let's go back to our website, and if we click on this previous button we are taken to the previous story, and if we click on this next button we are taken to the next story. But if you go all the way to the left side and if you are on the first story, and if I click on the previous button, we will have an error. So I'll just open the console and I'll just show you the error. So here we can see in the console it says cannot read properties of undefined, because the current active variable is now set to -1, and in the array we don't have an index of -1. So for that, let's go back to our code and let's add an if condition over here. So here for the previous button, let's tap if, and let's tap current active, and if the current active is less than or equal to 0, then we'll just return from this function. So I'll just tap return. Now if you go back to our design, and if I click on this first story, and if I click on this previous button, we don't have any errors. Right now let's do the same for the next button. So let's go back, and here let's tap if, and here we need to check whether it is the last element. So for that you have to tap current active, and we need to see whether it is greater than or equal to all stories, which is the array dot length -1, and here we'll just tap return. So this line of code will check whether we are on the last story, and if we are on the last story then we'll just return without doing anything. So let's go back and let's see whether everything is working alright, and we don't have any problems. Let's click on the close button, and it is working alright. Now here we can see when we are on a smaller screen, the close button cannot be clicked. So for that, let's add a z index to this. So let's go back to the style.css file, and let's go to the styles of the close button. So here for this close button, let's add a z index, and I'll just type 20. And now if we click on this close button, we can see that it is working alright. So that's basically how you can create this stories design using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Alright, so that's basically it for this video. If you have any doubts, you can ask in the comments below. And if you like this video, please click on the like button and subscribe to this channel to get the latest video updates. Thanks a lot for watching. Have a nice day.